Okay. Well, welcome everyone to CSI Skill Tree. In this series, we take a close look at video games to examine and celebrate the work they do in envisioning the future and building rich and thought-provoking worlds. My name is Joey Eschrick at the Center for Science and the Imagination at Arizona State University, and I'll be your host today. We're going to talk about Kentucky Route Zero in this episode. It's a magical, realist adventure game about a secret paranormal highway running through the caves beneath Kentucky. The game's themes, which we're going to get much more into through this discussion, include hidden and exploited labor, debt, alienation, globalization, artistic expression as a form of resilience, automation, the collision of the digital and physical worlds, how history haunts our experience of the present and our possible futures. There's a lot going on. In terms of production history, Kentucky Route Zero, very briefly, was released in 5 acts between 2013 and 2020. It was developed by Cardboard Computer, a 3-person production house, and published by Annapurna Interactive. And it received initial support starting in 2011 from the Kickstarter crowdfunding platform. It's a critically acclaimed game, it's worth saying up top. It was included in several Best of the Decade lists for the 2010s. It was nominated for a Nebula Award for Best Game Writing, and it won a BAFTA Games Award in 2021 this year. So today I'm delighted to have 2 amazing guests with me. And first, I'm very happy to be joined by Zoyander Street. Hi, Zoyander. Zoyander is an artist, researcher, and critic working at the fringes of indie video games for more than a decade. Led by ethnographic and historical research, they create lo-fi, glitchy games and custom hardware for festivals, galleries, and museums using interactive design to harness the expressive potential of audience participation. They're on the boards of Neon Digital Arts and Critical Distance, and they are a Ph.D. student in sociology at Lancaster University. They are a neurodivergent, genderqueer trans man living in South Yorkshire in the country currently known as the United Kingdom. I'm also honored to be joined by Dr. Rachel Carr. Hi, Rachel. Rachel is an assistant professor of English and the program coordinator for women's and gender studies at Lindsey Wilson College in Columbia, Kentucky. Before that, she was an assistant writing program administrator at the University of Kentucky. Her current research project explores how modernist literature reckons with the plantation system's impact on the natural world. And Rachel, thank you so much for joining us and for joining us from Kentucky. I'm really excited for your perspectives on how the game makes sense of Kentucky or throws us out of sense with Kentucky.
Yeah.
We'll start off by talking a bit about the game's structure and story and mechanics, and then its relationship to the Southern Gothic genre to kind of get us started off and grounded. And while we're doing that, we're going to run a gameplay video in the background featuring clips from the first hour of the game, so the very beginning, just so you can get a sense of its look and feel. I'll warn you that it's just image-wise occasionally quite dark and it's text-heavy. This is a text adventure in some ways. We're going to talk more about that too, but you may have trouble reading the text. Zoom does a little bit of downscaling, but try to just let the vibe kind of wash over you, and Zoyander and Rachel will help to contextualize what you're seeing as well. After that opening segment, we'll delve more into the game's relationship to other narrative-focused games, how it represents Kentucky and the US South, and more. And then we'll turn to responding to your questions and comments. We're very excited for those. I should say throughout the conversation anytime, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window to submit a question or a comment. You don't have to wait until the Q&A session at the end. Like, you can just drop the questions or thoughts in at any time. So as soon as something occurs to you, you just drop it in there. And thank you to everybody, for speakers and audience members, for joining us today. And without any further ado, let's get underway. Zoyander, can you start off by telling us a little bit about Kentucky Route Zero, the broad outlines of its story, and a bit about maybe the experience of play?
Yeah, I think I'm going to repeat a little bit of what you were saying just a minute ago. No, that's me not thinking ahead. But yeah, so as you say, it's a narrative game set in the American South, but it's like a surrealist or magical realist imagining of the landscape in a lot of ways. And through meeting this connected web of different characters, it shares this series of reflections about memory and loss and place, and particularly about how places that are haunted by their histories can be fully active in the this kind of very long present. and what it's like to try and build something for each other when we don't necessarily have a future horizon that we're building towards. At least that's a lot of what it speaks to me. And it's more or less explicitly anti-capitalist, engages with histories of colonialism and the present day context of economic decline in former mining towns. It's a point and click adventure game, but it also makes a lot of stylistic references to text-based dungeon crawlers and to tabletop RPGs. And it has sequences that are entirely text-based with nothing really happening visually at all.
I was going to say, in this scene that we're seeing right now, you actually, I don't know if it's in the edit, but you come across, as a tip-off, you come across people playing a tabletop RPG game. Like it's one of the first things that you see in the game. So it's the developers and writers tipping their hat a little bit there.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and then you can see here that the people who are playing a tabletop role-playing game disappear, and it's hinted that they're probably ghosts or something. So you've got this kind of sense of everything being haunted and of the things that you're doing really being about how you respond to the moment more than they are about responding to the logical problems that are in front of you. So you're primarily making dialogue choices, and sometimes you're exploring branching paths, and that might be in the actual physical space that you're in. And one of the things that stands out about it is that player agency is quite ambiguous. So normally, a kind of design orthodoxy of video games is that you should be making interesting choices that have consequences. In Kentucky Route Zero, it is not entirely clear kind of whether your actions are going to have consequences. A lot of the time, it's about in what way are you going to lean into the vibe? Like what kind of in a way, it's what kind of character you're all playing, but as the game goes on, you find that you're not even playing a protagonist. Like there are multiple characters operating here, and it's more that you're making choices that change the way it feels to be in that moment. And I think that's one of the things that really stood out about the game when it first was released. And it's one of the ways that the game's narrative is really in harmony with its mechanics, I think. Really, it's asking you how you're going to respond to the present moment and not how are you going to practically solve problems.
Yeah, I think it really gets away from that point and click adventure idea of like being given a series of linear puzzles that you have to solve by like finding the right tool, like finding the wrench or the code that you need to like solve the puzzle and move on to the next room. And often the responses that you're giving in dialogue are kind of oblique. It's not quite clear. You have to decide what they mean. And I think the developers, for people who like want to situate this aesthetically to some extent, like the developers say that they were inspired by David Lynch. And so there is some of that like, formlessness and like, some very like cryptic exchanges that come to make sense more and more as the plot unfolds. But I don't think it's quite as oblique as Lynch gets sometimes. But I think playing other games where you make dialogue tree choices, it feels very instrumental in comparison to this game, where I feel like you're often kind of responding in a really abstract way, and the choices you make don't really like build to a morality system. It's not like you're deciding whether you're a good or bad character. I think that's kind of important. I think in a decade where lots and lots of video games were buying into that model of like, a morality system of like a Manichaean good or bad morality system, I think this jumbles that up quite a bit. I think we should say too that this is the premise of the story where we're starting is that you initially are playing as this character called Conway, who drives a truck for an antique shop, and you're supposed to make a delivery to an address, 5 Dogwood Drive, that you can't find in any maps. And that is where the titular Kentucky Route Zero comes in. It seems like maybe the only way to get to Dogwood Drive might be through this secret highway that initially it's not totally clear whether it exists or not or how to get to it. Zoyander, do you want to add any more, or I wanted to see if Rachel has any thoughts as someone who's, I know, just played through the game like I have recently.
That's everything I wanted to say about it. Yeah.
Go
Well,
ahead.
so I think, oh, I told you all. So rather than playing through the game, I chose to watch someone else play the game. So there, I was able to find plenty of recordings of people just playing their way through. And so I think I'm actually jumping ahead a little bit into the second question, but as we think about what this is like, or for me, I've been so fascinated by like the narratology or the creation of the narrative in this, that I did very much feel like I was almost reading a work of literature or being really immersed into this Gothic world, especially as I got to read this dialogue. And so you mentioned that the game developers said they were inspired by David Lynch, and I certainly feel that. But I also love that they mentioned like Flannery O'Connor as well, that they were looking to sort of an American literary tradition and translating it across mediums, which I find absolutely fascinating.
Zoya, do you want to add something else, please?
Yeah, no, I definitely concur, and I think the experience of playing it is like it is in a lot of ways very similar to the experience of reading fiction. Like there's, again, like the way that the game is, it provides choices, but they're not instrumental. Like you'll often see, I don't know if it's about to happen in what we're seeing on screen, but you'll have like one option and then another option, but it's like one thought followed another. It's like they are sequential, like they're branching, but it's also important which one was displayed first. And yeah, so there's something kind of, in those moments, there's something a little bit poetic about the meter to it as well, I guess. I don't know if that's the right term, but the way that you're getting these like fragments one after another that join up to tell you something about a mental state, but neither of them are, well, if you choose one of them to say, neither of them are going to be events, like, I don't know, they're not going to be performed alongside one another. One of them is going to be chosen.
Rachel, did you want to talk maybe a little bit more, just go into that second question that I alluded to, or that you alluded to?
Yeah.
You know, Rachel studies U.S. Southern literature and to some extent the Southern Gothic. You know much more about it than I do anyway, vastly more. And so, yeah, I was hoping you could help us situate this game within that tradition, you know, that I think people think of primarily as like a literary genre that, you know, just really unfolds primarily in books. So like if you could give us a sense of what you and scholars mean when you talk about the Southern Gothic, and then how the game makes use of it or tweaks it or changes it.
I mean, it's definitely one of the reasons why I was so excited to watch this game, to think about sort of like, what is this new Gothic that we see emerging, or how are we still working with an American Gothic genre? And then also being from Kentucky and kind of close to where the game is supposedly set, I was also thrilled by that, right, to see how it's creating this space. But anyway, so when I think about the Gothic, you know, I mean, people have been writing about it for years and years and years and years, and it of course starts as a European genre. So I always think of this one book that for me just clarified it, which was Franco Moretti's Atlas of the European Novel, right? And this is a fairly old piece of literary criticism, but in it, he's like, this is what the Gothic genre is. It is fundamentally tied to place, specific places. And to prove that, I mapped it for you. Like, here's a map of all the Gothic works in the 17 and 1800s, right? And it's like this one little forest in Germany, occasionally like a nice bog or a creepy moor or something. But he's like, here is where Gothic literature happens, right? Which created a little bit of a problem when people started saying, well, no, we're also talking about the American Gothic, or specifically Southern Gothic. So some people argue that the Gothic is just a set of aesthetic traits, right? Like a creepy raven knocking on your door and whispering things, or you see a ghost in a creepy moor at night. But it's also fundamentally more than that. And so sort of my favorite American Gothic scholar, or sort of Southern literature scholar, was Patricia Yeager. And she has this amazing quote where she says that place is never simply place in Southern writing, but always a site where trauma has been absorbed into the landscape. And I think the Gothic genre is fundamentally about that trauma working its way out, right? It's like the past interceding into our present, that past we tried to bury, which I think parallels so nicely with Zoyander's poetic introduction, where they were saying that, you know, we're sort of seeing this as a haunting of a colonial past, of a capitalist past, or sort of these disasters that the landscape or the place we can never move away from, right? They're going to come back to haunt us. So So yes, while the Gothic genre is a set of aesthetic traits that are very much present in this game, the darkness, the eeriness, especially the scene where you're walking through the forest and there's sort of the giant eagle just kind of like lingering through the trees or the still of that shot, right? Certainly this idea of like something a little spooky, something a little isolating, maps very well into the Southern Gothic. And you can see this tradition that they're playing with that writers like Flannery O'Connor, for example, who they identify as sort of an inspiration for this bring in. But also it's very much about Kentucky itself and Kentucky's own Gothic history, sort of springing up into these places. And so I'm really fascinated both by the connection about Kentucky's specific world and the way they work with this, and also this game as a contribution to Gothic literature more broadly, or as a contribution to sort of world horrors, right? Like mind collapses that are, of course, unique to Kentucky and not, right? Unique to the United Kingdom as well, or sort of unique all over the world. I'm sorry, I said that wrong. They're both like very unique regional places, right? Places where trauma come up, but are also so systemic. That's what I was trying to get to. And I think that's what the Gothic genre is about. And I think this game engages with it in really exciting ways.
Yeah, I love what you said about things that being both specific and systemic. I feel like that's so core to like how, like what Kentucky, what the game is like portraying, and like why it resonates.
Yeah.
When we talk about just, oh, go ahead, Rachel, please.
No, sorry. I was just going to say, I think everyone, it does feel very particularly American in some ways, just the large empty spaces, that sort of feeling of a place that should be wilderness, but is also just like a gas station, or it feels so abandoned, but there are still people almost like moving like ghosts through it, or sometimes literal ghosts just moving through, repeating these actions. But it's also still somehow universal, right? That I think this is a feeling that everyone has had as we sort of witness these horrors that we just pave over and keep moving through.
Yeah, I wanted to kind of just, for folks who maybe haven't played the game yet or haven't heard much about it in advance, like when we talk about trauma and the sorts of historical catastrophes and things we've been discussing that the game deals with, maybe you all could give a couple examples, just little capsule examples of things the game is dealing with. I think that would be helpful to just sort of illustrate some of what we've been discussing so far. So for me, I'll just say for me, there's this whole thing. I'll just give you a second to think. There's this whole thing of like debt as a major issue that starts to emerge later in the game, and there's a sort of pivotal scene. We're going to talk a little bit more about how some of the scenes in this game are staged just kind of in artistic settings or theatrical settings. But there's the scene that's set up kind of as a play in a bar, and it's all about debt, and they use the trope of the bar tab, but then blow out from that and talk about the electric company, and then talk about almost these like kind of indenture contracts that people get into with both the electric company and then later with this distillery, this whiskey distillery that's local, and that turns nightmarish and surreal very quickly. But you know, that idea of like debt as a form of social control, I think, as the game goes on, sort of blossoms. It's not something that's in the first scene necessarily, but as time goes on, it seems to me that it's you and then you come to recognize that debt and things like addiction that are tied up with alcohol are kind of central to the trauma that you can kind of sense in the way the characters move and talk and comport themselves, but you don't necessarily know things about them in the first act of the game that contextualize those. So that's my little example of trauma and how it fits into the landscape and the institutions, I guess, that are meeting it out.
I think really similarly. For me also, I mean, of course, like the Elkhorn mine scene, that I think it's if the headlamp, the torch goes out, you kind of get these ideas of ghostly presences, you know, or actual ghosts of miners are moving through around you. So we know like this specific accident, or finding all of the helmets in the mine that are just sitting there, those abandoned helmets. And of course, the scene with the whiskey, which should be bourbon. Also, just a side note, unimportant, right? That's like a bourbon still. No, not for you. I think the game calls it whiskey, and I was like, Kentucky has bourbon. No, unimportant. But so there's this note of like So the driver has taken a drink of very, very expensive whiskey, bourbon, whatever it is, without realizing how expensive it is, and now it's going to have to drive to pay off this extreme debt. And so you're kind of talking too, I think it also alludes to all of these traumas that are so present in rural spaces. We see addiction, savaging, rural places, we see sort of economic collapse, poverty. But again, it plays really interestingly with a specifically Kentucky narrative, right? Or specific Kentucky trauma of, well, what have bourbon distilleries done to our environment? Do we know yet? Do we know what they've done to the people? What about the mines, right? Like, what have they done to these towns and these communities, these people? Because, when we see, if Kentucky's sort of mentioned at all, if it's in a positive way, it's like, oh, amazing horse racing, horse farms, bourbon drinking, sort of this narrative of vice. But then we see like what that vice is actually doing to people in these rural communities. And I think that's a trauma that the game alludes to in really fascinating ways.
Yeah, I guess there are so many moments of trauma that like really resonate with me in the game, but like the one that I think I'm going to be reflecting on for like another few years maybe is like the final act of the game is on the face of it about building a utopian collective community to try and escape from all of this, but also it's like quite a lengthy reflection on how you don't get to build these projects without participating in the erasure of something that came before. And you're uncovering, maybe you're not uncovering, I think that's probably the wrong metaphor to use, but you're becoming more and more aware of how much was lost over the last 100 or 200 years of developing this particular place that is you're never going to get back, and you're witnessing a loss happening in that moment as well, of things having been destroyed by a natural disaster, and people having pretty much given up on the dream that they were building and being ready to move on, and like making this choice to another group of people making this choice to come in and take it up and start something new. But it's not out of a very specific kind of idealism of like, ideologically, this is what we're trying to build, and like, this is why it's going to be awesome. But just like, okay, well, here we are. Like, I think we can give this a go. I think I'm going to be here for a while. And again, I keep thinking of it as a long present rather than a futurity. And that feels significant to me. Like, when I think about alternatives to the system we've all been operating under for however long, that like it's not speculating on a future and extracting things from the past and the present in order to like pay something forward to that, in terms of like another way that debt is produced is through this speculation and this like this productive futurism of some kind. But it's just, okay, what's happening now, and like how much more of this now do we want to keep doing? Yeah, and it's like an interesting way of thinking about like how we heal from that trauma, that there isn't necessarily sort of a triumph that we will get to that will make all of it worth it.
Yeah, I really like how you put that, and it makes me think of the way the game's utopian moments are very practical and very grounded. Like, I would say one of the little kernels of utopianism in this game is this public access TV station, which some of the characters are involved in. It's just like it's a sort of scrappy, not-for-profit, community station. They run all these strange art videos from people in the community and sort of try to celebrate the creativity of people there. But it's just like held together with spit and duct tape, and it's constantly falling apart. And it's also like still just a TV production. Like, it's not anything grandiose. It's not like a kind of early 19th century utopia. Let's remake the entirety of society. It's just people saying like, we have this little thing and we're going to try to run it in a way that like we're comfortable with and that we don't feel like is exploitative, and that like celebrates and in some way feeds back to our community. But like, I'm almost making it more grandiose and romantic than it is to the people who are involved. You see it as very workaday. And that last act, which in contrast to the gameplay video we saw, is beautifully green and bright. It's a visually very distinct from the rest of the game. Nevertheless, like it's not, as you were saying, Zoyander, and being around a lot of futures thinking in my job, like it's not it's not that sense that like we're going to turn the page and have something new or better, or that there's some like technology that's going to make everything work better and allow us to like get off the grid. And it's just like people are, in some ways, all these characters find themselves at the end of the line, and they don't have anywhere to necessarily go, and they can't get outside of like exploitation. They can't get outside of an economy that's ground them down. But they're kind of trying to say like, well, I'll elect to stay here and like see what I can do in this space, which is this little kind of rural village that has a history that we learn about in that act. But yeah, it's that sense of like a real lived utopia being less kind of perfect than like, that literary or philosophical term often implies. Like, I think we almost want to take back that term and kind of make it a little more domestic and just say like, utopia is just something we do, and we're trying to like get along and do something that's, less exploitative than what we'd be doing otherwise and feeds us in some way.
Gosh, does it say something about us that we've taken anything that's not defeatism as utopian?
I know, right? Yeah. Well, it reminds me, Eric Olin Wright, the recently passed sociologist, wrote a lot about utopias in real life, and he would write about like libraries. It's like he's like, this is like kind of a utopian institution. He was appreciative, if not totally uncritical, of Wikipedia. He didn't think it was perfect, but he's like, here's the thing that's, but it was like, in some ways his project was not to like find breakaway communities that were living in the middle of, it wasn't like looking for the next Shakers or something. It was like, how are little buds of utopianism kind of contained in a system that is kind of hostile to its values? So
I think something that you see over and over again, and you see it with that TV station as well, is that Kentucky Route Zero's perspective on utopia isn't that you are creating something that's completely clean of the systems of exploitation. Like the TV station is, like, if I get this right, like it's funded by the power company, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Or
like
it was.
You're making some sort of bargain with power to get something that makes you a bit more alive.
Rachel, I was wondering if you wanted to talk, because we kind of got into it a bit in this section, a little bit more about Kentucky. I mean, a little bit more about how this game, what the game has to say about Kentucky, or about our imagination about rural spaces, or spaces that are, I don't even know if rural is the right word, because as we talked about, there's a sense that it's not like we're in a bunch of agricultural land. It's like sort of just spaces that aren't part of the like cosmopolitan edge of contemporary capitalist life, on a global scale. Like, this is a forgotten landscape in some way for people who aren't there. So yeah, I don't, but that in and of itself is sort of a story that I'm layering on top of what the game's doing. So I'm interested in what you think as somebody who's thought about representations of the South and of Kentucky, but also is from there and is familiar with some of the geographies and the social geographies here.
Yeah. So I think I maybe mentioned in the beginning, maybe not. I live quite close to sort of where this is supposedly happening, or, Kentucky strangely has like the longest cave system in the world. And I took a bunch of students there last Saturday. So, we're seeing these spaces, but it feels very much removed from like what I was saying earlier, the typical Kentucky narrative, which if it's mentioned sort of a broader metropolitan places, people are like, bourbon, that's where the bourbon is from. Or I went to the Derby once, right? These sort of large vice narratives. Or, the flip side is the complete opposite, where we know that Kentucky is a very poor state. Kentucky is an abandoned state. They're the lowest state in education, or one of the lowest state in education. And there's really no in between. And I think Kentucky Route Zero is trying to operate in that in between. And they're showing very much of, well, what has happened to these places that are, I keep using the word abandoned, but probably more accurate would to say like no longer valuable, right? Can no longer produce resources that are needed, and have sort of been completely extracted, right? And so I always found myself thinking a lot, or one of the parts of this game that really struck me is there's a scene where there's just a sermon about the virtues of hard work and sort of rugged individualism playing in the background. And I find that has become sort of a dominant narrative pushed on people, or sort of pushed on Kentucky, or happening in rural spaces, right? Like, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, we're independent, we don't need help, when of course we were completely ravaged by systemic forces, right? Or I know I mentioned this with Zoyander before, this idea that like, well, coal is what keeps the lights on. And so we need to like have this individual force or support, when of course it's well, coal that destroyed so much, right? Coal that has sort of created this left behind underworld in some ways. And then the other narrative, and I'll come back to that point later if we want to. The other point that I think about of Kentucky a lot in terms of like a Southern Gothic history is that Kentucky is the borderlands, right? Especially if we're going back in American history between slavery and freedom, right? And Kentucky was a slave state and stayed so for a long time. So even though they didn't secede, right, it was still this like, you still had to get out of Kentucky for freedom. So I think there are all these conflicting, like a history of labor exploitation. Of course, Kentucky and mine workers in general had a huge labor rights movement that has just been completely flushed. This history of enslavement that has also sort of been eradicated by these ideas like vices. Whiskey distilling was an enslaved man. He was the one who taught the knowledge to Jack Daniel with the training in Tennessee. Like it's all of this indigenous knowledge that has sort of been stolen. We know too, like, well, when we look at the large cave systems or we look at the mines, oftentimes enslaved men and women were sent there to work, which is often kind of, again, pushed underground. So I think in pulling out the sort of aesthetic Gothic traits, or even just the sort of openly Gothic world of Kentucky, it's a really interesting framing that pushes against the way Kentucky is typically portrayed as a bunch of sort of like poor people living out in the country for whatever reason, or sort of these like cities of partying or vices or production. And Kentucky Route Zero, to me, in some ways, is showing far more of a reality, right? That it's people just trying to make it and still being forced to live within a system that has extracted everything and then just sort of left you, like, what's left? What do we create now in this sort of empty, extracted world? And I like that it does show that there are creative forces at work, right? There is sort of a pushback against the sort of systemic extraction, but what do we do with that?
Yeah, I think there's this thing that in the writing where, and this may be true with any kind of an environmental immersive game that really pays attention to place, but like, there's a lot of local history, and it is like the local history of like frequently when the coal companies, when the power company was really productive and really profitable. So that means larger scale exploitation, but it also means more investment. And so you see now like, the telephone switchboard operator, in this like big station has been like moved into this like dank flooded area. Now there's only one person left. There's a lot of this kind of like infrastructure where it's cheaper to maybe, or it's like there's one person left behind. There's one person who works at the bar. There's one person who works at the switchboard. There seems to be one person who works at the gas station. There's just like the vestiges of a system that was really profitable at extracting from the land and like extracting from its workers. But then now all of the monuments or all the artifacts of that system are still in the landscape. But nobody's there. That's the sense that maybe it's haunted. Like you frequently get the sense like, are the people here ghosts? Or like there'll be someone in a scene, where you're talking to someone and then there's this other person there and you're like, is this person really here? Would everyone see them? Is it just me and this other character who see them? Like what's, I don't know. There's a sense that like the past is still there, but it's dilapidated and abandoned in a lot of ways. So yeah.
Yeah. I think that's kind of like my wrap up for Kentucky. I feel like I threw a lot of things out there in a very short amount of time. But I do like your point that you never quite know, like, am I with a ghost? Is this actually happening? Is this a metaphor or is this like a reality? Am I about to actually encounter a giant eagle that is this child's brother? Am I, even from the very early scenes where you're at the gas station and of course you go in the basement and there are people playing like a tabletop game that are maybe not real, you find out later. And so I think the game is, right, am I remembering that correctly?
That's definitely one way of reading it. Yeah.
Okay, maybe not. Maybe I'm just off.
Well, they certainly disappear without a trace. Like, you essentially turn a corner and they're gone.
Maybe it's just a creepy moment that I was interpreting as ghostly.
I interpreted it as ghostly as well. Yeah, and like you go and get a reality check from Joseph, and he says like, no, there's no one there. So as you say, they're probably not real. Yeah.
They come back later. And so I was like, well, like, are they real now? I don't know. There's like, and then the sense of like the game's acts and then the order of the scenes in the acts. It's not as if it's got some linearity to it, it seems like, but maybe it's like only some of the characters you control might be experiencing this as a linear thing, but I don't think like for the player, it doesn't really feel linear, even if everything might feel linear to, for example, Conway, the first character that you come in. But although I don't think that's totally clear either. By the end, I was like very tied up in knots about the timeline, which I think is intentional.
I made a note the other day that like the game keeps like visually and in terms of the narrative structure, it keeps using loops and it uses branching structures, but then the branches aren't necessarily like you have the stem and the branch comes off there, like they intersect like that. You can go backwards on a branch from the stem. So I found, that was like, okay, it seems to be making a statement about that things either loop or they are tangled up in a way with no forward and back.
Yeah. Well, I think there's something to that as well about pushing back or like sort of puncturing this narrative of like progress, right? That progress is always like economic moving forward or a new industry or something coming through. Even in, like you're saying, the narrative structure of a game about a delivery, to me, I assumed what I was anticipating when I started watching this game would be that we were on the road and maybe like you would see a player having to like drive around or dodge something. That's what I was thinking with a video game, and it's not that at all, right? There is no linear structure. And I think that sort of mirrors this idea of extraction or abandonment, or like, well, what is the future going to be? Like Zoyander, you mentioned, we're in a long present, that an idea of progress that is built on like individual hard work or relying on a system to save us is just not there. And I think we see that with the flood at the end as well, that when we think of traditional ways of moving forward, it's just not going to happen under the systems that have created this world in the first place.
So Zoyander, I want to ask, one of the things when we first were talking about this and when we talked to Rachel initially was that maybe there was some resonances for you as a person who's lived in the north of England, that, and I'm wondering, now that we've set up the ways this maps out Kentucky imaginatively and physically, how does that strike you after having thought more about it?
Yeah, like there's a lot of, it's easy for me to understand what the resonances were now, because it was hard to put my finger on for a while, aside from the kind of very broad generalization that people sometimes make that the north of England is the equivalent to the south in the US. And it's like, well, what does that mean exactly? Like, what's actually going on there? And part of it is just like the like materiality of the landscape that they focus on in Kentucky Route Zero are often the things that it shares in common with South Yorkshire, where I'm from. So this whole thing of like having a settlement that was built on coal mining is exactly the landscape that I'm in, and that the poverty and kind of sense of at times hopelessness of being in a post-industrial landscape because coal is no longer needed. And what you were saying, Rachel, about the politics of like solving the area's problems being seen as, well, we need to bring coal mining back. Because what people remember is that when they felt their labor was needed, they felt a sense of pride and purpose in that way. But they like don't want to think too much about how deeply horrible and traumatic working in the coal industry actually was, because it's not a nice thing to think about, but also there isn't a clear alternative. Like there isn't, again, like we keep talking about this, like no forward and back, because there isn't a clear forward. Just saying, well, you don't really want to go back to do that thing that was forcibly taken away from you by Margaret Thatcher. Like it's difficult to sort of it's difficult to sort of see that as anything other than just a terrible loss when there isn't anything to look forward to either. And I'm very positive about my hometown, and I don't think that like we don't have a future in that sense, but I do think that there isn't a specific vision of where we're going, and that makes things very challenging. And there's also the thing that kind of drew me to wanting to talk about this game, and particularly wanting to talk about it with someone from the region, was that I have this general sense that there's a pastoral or like peripheral like configuration of places like Kentucky and like South Yorkshire that like, or just like the North in general, really, that like they're seen as these, as you know, as you were saying, like they're empty, or like it's this kind of wilderness or would-be wilderness that you travel to and then you leave, or you grow up there and you leave, like you have to leave, or else your life is gonna like not go anywhere. And you know, I even see it in portrayals of the north of England that are very loving and that are really rooted in a sense of care for this place, often portray it as this just very rural, and like there isn't like active ongoing like modern contemporary life happening here. It's all just very quaint. And I find it wildly offensive, even though I know it's well meant. Like I live here and I'm a person doing things here, and like everyone I know here are like people who are actively doing things, interesting, creative things here. And that was, I felt, what Kentucky Route Zero is doing in its portrayal of Kentucky. Like it's rejecting that idea of the pastoral being quaint and backwards, and going like, well, there isn't a backwards or a forwards, and like people are actively doing interesting creative things everywhere, because that's what humans do, and it's just affirming it as like, this is what it means to be alive.
That's such a fascinating point. So there's some of the airports where they're like shirts, and there's a cute little slogan that you see a lot around Kentucky where it's like, in Kentucky, there are more bourbon barrels than people. And like, yeah, that's true. But I think when we start kind of selling this pastoral narrative, or selling this narrative, like it just overlooks, like you're saying, like, no, there are people here who are extraordinarily resilient, who are working in these spaces, who are working against these systems, but sort of narratively are just completely overlooked, right? And so I enjoyed seeing this game try to like dig a little bit more into those spaces, or show us a little bit more of that world. You just summed that up so well. My brain is still thinking about it as I'm trying to kind of talk and process it. And I was so fascinated by this sort of parallel. I know this is going a little bit off topic, but I read this article. It was like, what are we going to do to save Eastern Kentucky? How are we going to bring in industry back to Kentucky? And they were like, we'll use the old coal mines for Bitcoin mines. And I was like, that's not it. You know, like, that's not it. Again, it's just a new process of extraction, right? Just this idea that the system will save us, when there are actually so many people working to form their own communities and own sort of groups outside of a system, because it's sort of, you know, we've seen the system fail. So you have such a strong, powerful community that has sprung up, which I think is similar to what you're describing, right? Of people sort of making their own lives and like little utopian nuggets. Joey, I think that was your phrase, right? That we see hinted at through these communities. But still, people are always looking for some sort of new system to come in and be the solution, when we all know how that ends, right? Pushing again against that idea that like there is a progress to be made, or there is some sort of grand economic progress to be had here.
So that actually brings me to something. I'm trying to kind of mishmash some of the questions that I'm looking at on my screen here. But one of the things that people are doing, and one of the ways that these communities of people in the game, and that some of the folks that I think y'all are both talking about, are engaged in creative work, creative labor. And this is one of the first things that Zoyander and I talked about with this game, is the way it uses and reclaims artistic spaces, and it puts into video games, you know, museum exhibitions or musical performances quite beautifully. I think those are some of my favorite moments. But also processes of like ethnographic observation. Like when you go down to the caves, you don't only find traces of the miners, but you really importantly find traces of these like historians who are doing this oral history, basically. So I guess I wanted to ask what you all thought about like the way the game uses artistic spaces and artistic expression within the game text to kind of mediate the way that you're seeing these landscapes, to mediate the way you're seeing characters, the way the game's talking about things like labor, exploitation, solidarity. Yeah, like what is why that decision? Because of course you could have like really focused this game on the work that people are doing. It's like, okay, this person works at a gas station. This person does work at a coal mine that's operating at a much less intensive rate. We do see a bartender, but a lot of the people we see are kind of cultural and artistic workers in various ways. There's scenes, there's another huge scene that's very striking that takes place in a museum. And while you don't see the staff directly, it's quite clear their presence. So yeah, I don't know. I'd like to hear what you all think about that, and especially Zoyander, I know, as someone who creates installation art, this is like one of the times that I don't know that I see installation art that much in video games too. So I also think that's like worth remarking on and pointing up. It's like there's a real foregrounding of these forms of creative expression that you're maybe not seeing represented so much in science fiction or in genre literature or in games.
I replayed the museum scene recently, and there's so much there. Like, very early on, there's like an explicit reference to Nam June Paik. So there's like this real commitment to like, this is about media art. Like, if you're a media art person, then like this is where we are. And also the first thing that you, well, if you do it in the order it's presented to you, the first thing that you read in the museum scene is the wall text for the exhibition. And yeah, I should say, like, the museum staff are like very, like, you can hear them in that text, and like they have this bit where they very diplomatically say this exhibition was a massive pain in the ass to install, and that art really like tests our patience as both viewers and exhibitors. And having had a few like stressful experiences getting my work exhibited, I was like, oh, I can really hear that exhibitions are often presented to you in this very clean and finished way. Like, what you're seeing should be like functioning perfectly and exactly how the artist intended, and like everything was smooth and nothing got in the way. And it's nice to sort of read this like museum text that's like, this was really challenging, and that's part of what makes art interesting. And I feel like that's sort of a recurring thing, that art is an active work that people are doing. It's not a industry of like where you trade valuable objects. Like, it's not about that at all. It's about kind of an ongoing practice of making things happen and making places. And I think the way that art is being used in the game, kind of my take on it is that it's about the alternative to alienated labor under capitalism. Like, it's about this question of you have so much labor power to give. Where's it all going to go? Like, how much of it is going to be extracted by these systems of power, and how much of it is going to go into caring for your community and this self-actualization? I guess another thing it's doing is it's rejecting the simplified reading of Maslow's pyramid, that like you only get to self-actualization when you've got everything else filled. And it's going like, no, everything can be precarious, but you can still be working on this top bit because that's why you're alive. Like, yeah, I think that art is always shown in a way that's in dialogue with labor.
Rachel, any thoughts about the way the game's using artistic and creative expression in that way? Things it makes you think of?
It does, but I also want to make sure. I just figured out how to see the Q&A questions, and there's some really great ones that we're definitely gonna get to those.
Yeah, I think once we kind of round the corner on this topic, I want to get to some of those. Yeah.
I was like, oh, notifications. Yeah, so I was thinking too more, less from a media studies perspective, I think solely because of my background, right? But I was thinking more about where we see hints of like historians or archaeologists or anthropologists or museum creators. I was thinking about it as sort of like narrative control, of trying to write back or control, and how it represents some sort of almost like temporal compression or layering, going back to that idea of like a long present, that the game never really lets the past be in the past, right? One, it keeps intruding on us aesthetically, thematically, but also in these little hints, right? That people were still constantly trying to make sense of the past in a game where we're suddenly trying to make sense of the past of the game, which I know that sounded a little bit confusing, right? But I think it does kind of cause this temporal like compression loop, of like, well, what is the past and what is the present? And we don't actually know. in the game necessarily, like how long ago was this past? What is happening? Where are we in it? And I think that plays very much for me into who gets to control this narrative, like what is the story happening here? And so we're seeing sort of these attempts of writing these stories happening around us, and we're sort of seeing behind the curtain, like in the museum, I think, or in the cave system of trying to write these stories.
Yeah, I think the way that everyone's always working with obsolete technology is definitely doing that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and
sorry, Zoe, you were going to say something.
Oh, I was just going to say that a lot of the reference that people are working with, it goes along with the tech. Like the music is folk music. I mean, it's music that dates back quite a ways. You know, some of the characters dress a little retro. There's a lot of kind of old ways of doing things. We see some mail delivery by plane because there's no built infrastructure for some of these communities, we find out. So yeah, there's a sense that like there's a great appreciation for the past, but that appreciation doesn't take the form of like remix culture, right? It's not like trying to update the past for the present. So I don't know. I think the game, as we talked about a lot, like I think wants to kind of carve out a different space where it's like, this isn't nostalgia. It's not looking back, but it is grappling with the way that like, if we're not talking about the past ever in our moment lived experiences, perhaps that's just us like willfully ignoring it versus it not being relevant. And I think, yeah, there's all these like pretty tangible ways that comes through, whether it's through like old technological interfaces. I also think that the thing you mentioned, Rachel, about time, the way that the game frames so many of its vignettes artistically makes it harder to impose a temporal structure on it. So you'll be watching a scene and you'll realize it's a play, or you'll be experiencing all this stuff that's relevant to the story and game world and characters, but it turns out, you know, they're art exhibits, or it's like, you know, there's a TV show, but it's like that's being filmed at one point for the local access station, but it's like, when is this taking place? And it eventually sort of becomes clear, but it's like you're often dislocated, and it's the artistic framing within the narrative scrambles your ability to put it in order, because often people are coming through a composed and designed scene rather than just experiencing like a spontaneous interaction. Like things that seem unscripted are scripted, and vice versa sometimes. I think in this world. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so I think it is probably time to take some of these very good questions. So we'll take the first one we got in first. So from Stephen, thank you, Stephen. Wondering about your thoughts on how none of the main characters appear interested in fixing any of the problems they encounter. Escape to and through the zero, or finding a place to colonize appear to be the only answers anyone considers. What do we talked a little bit about the game's refusal of instrumentality, but this may kind of, you know, Stephen's point is a little bit like problematizing that a little bit and saying, you know, what do you think about that in terms of the structure of the game and you know, its approach to framing problems and solving them or avoiding them or otherwise?
I just realized it's quite interesting that like one of the first people Conway meets is someone who fixes old TVs. So like there is a kind of fixing that happens, but it's I have a friend who thinks a lot about maintenance as a design practice. And there's something around that that's kind of interesting to me here, that it's sort of rejecting, you know, as we've been saying, like it's rejecting this dream that you can find the technical solution that solves everything, or the ideological solution that solves everything. And instead going, okay, how do we make what we have just work for us so that we can keep going? I mean, to me, that feels more realistic. I think that the fact that they end up finding a place to colonize, again, I although it's troubling, I think it's also kinder to us, the people playing it, that it does it that way, rather than kind of coming up with some way that you can create an alternative and form a new community or something without engaging in colonization or gentrification or something like that. Like these things are always like, we are always colluding in them when we try to build something for each other. And I think the question is, how do we live with that in an ongoing way? And how do we pay attention so that when we can do something that's better or less evil and extractive, it's that choice is available to us. Like finding that alternative between like defeatism and kind of willfully ignorant utopianism.
Yeah, Joey, I didn't want to cut you off.
No, please go ahead. No, I was going to prompt you. So
yeah. Oh, thanks. So often when I think of the way I hear people talking about Kentucky, they frame it as a problem. And so for me, the game's refusal to say like, this is the thing that needs to be fixed, or we're going to have sort of a hero person coming in and trying to fix it. Like I mentioned earlier, so often the system is like, now we'll mine Bitcoin, now we'll do this other thing, now we'll create another industry. Sort of feels like more of a statement to me. And I'm not trying to say like, these aren't real problems, like access to proper medical care, addiction, rural abandonment. Of course, these are all very sincere, but I think it is almost a little bit radical to say like, this is a community of people trying to make a life, not looking for larger, more outside solutions to bring in. And so there's certainly this metaphor of like fixing old TVs or trying to like draw out things that are long obsolete, but also the fixing is like community help, right? Like you go to one person, and even that's a little bit frustrating, who's like, let me help you find the route, let me help you do this. And then in exchange, you're going to go down in the basement and turn my lights on, or you're going to do this other thing. And that's kind of what I was thinking from this question.
So I want to, we're fast running out of time. Well, we have a few more minutes, but I want to get to both of these two topics that are in here. And so I want to talk about first, the latter two questions here in our list, which is, both about the episodic nature of the game. And this is something actually, this question I'm going to meld, Miko, I hope I'm saying that right, Jeremy's questions, but that we wanted to talk a little bit more about structure, and I think we did that throughout a bit, but if we had another hour, we would talk a lot more about the structure of the game. But these questions are pointing out that the game was released over a very politically tumultuous period in the US, asking if things change historically, or if the game changes its attitude to current events, I guess, throughout that period. And then also Miko's question kind of, I think in some ways does that to say, how does the episodic structure affect the way we interpret it as a piece of art? And how does this relate to other games? Because this is uniquely episodic. Most video games are not episodic. So I don't know, questions about sort of like structure, the episodic nature and relationship to current events in history. No big deal, just like a quick couple of minutes. But I want to touch on that and then talk about this last question also from Jeremy real quick if we have time.
I will be really quick on this one. I feel like for the past hour, I've just been like, narratology, and I'm just going to return to that when I think about this structure. Because again, for me, I think I was coming into this game and looking at it and thinking about it really like a literary work, right? That it's giving us the sense of fragmentation, isolation, that I think mark a lot of like the modern and even postmodern novel, right? Of that uncertainty of where we are. These feel like very literary characteristics to me that are meant to sort of disrupt and isolate the reader. And so the nature of the structure and the nature of this narrative, again, I think goes back to really pushing against the sort of like capitalist narrative of progress. And that to me was sort of one of the biggest outcomes of the game, that you both experience what it's like to be in one of these left behind places, and the structure and the sort of the episodic isolated nature shows or sort of pushes back again that there is like against the idea that there is a solution or that there is a progress to be had, or that we're always sort of on the up and up, that American idea of like we're always moving forward, things are always getting better. Well, they're not, right? Like our system is starting to fail, and I think the game reflects that through this narrative structure.
I'll just say, Zoyander, I'll just say real briefly before I forget what I wanted to say here, it'll be very quick, was that this style of releasing and then having critical and audience interpretations of the game is like, it is unique, and it does give you a different sense of how you might make sense of the text, because you have a year or two in between each episode to think about it. And I think the chunking of the game into episodes kind of invites you, I played it all at once recently, but like I imagine that it would encourage you to replay and think, and maybe replay again when the next act came out, and like really think about like, why did they make this episode? Why is it bounded the way it is? Like why pick this setting and scene? And you don't think about that with some video games, and you certainly could, but like the structure doesn't invite you to do it the way that this game's structure does. So I do think it optimizes for different things. So Andrew, go ahead. I'm sorry.
That's all right. I might have lost what I was
going
to say, actually. No, it's fine.
I feel terrible.
I did have something else on the episodic structure. Like part of what we gained from it being episodic in that way was that like it was a time when I think a lot changed in games. I just remembered what my other thing was. I'll try and be quick with this one. It was a time when a lot changed in games. Like the standard for game narrative, I think, like did get a lot higher during that decade, and it is partly because of the influence of Kentucky Route Zero, even among people who like weren't necessarily playing it, but the discourse about it kind of had a lot of ripple effects. The thing that I was thinking of is that like, although like it was a tumultuous time politically, also like nothing changed, right? Like none of the problems that Kentucky Route Zero is about remotely got like better at all, really, right? Like I think maybe Obamacare came in like since 2011, and like, but most of it is exactly as it was. And so like depressingly, like none of it became irrelevant, and like none of it, I imagine, I don't know, but it seems like you wouldn't have to change course as a writer like at all. All that's happening is like other reactions to the stuff that you're making this game about. Like as someone, like I'm making a game about a social problem, and like I keep both being a little bit nervous about and also really hoping that the problem my game is about will be partly solved by the time it's finished. And it keeps not happening. Like I would love for what I'm doing to become irrelevant or to have to like dramatically change it, but like the problems just continue to fester. And yeah, like that's depressing. But also probably like reinforce, like the fact that the game came out over this long time kind of, it reinforces the relevance of what it's about, right?
Is there another point, the one that I interrupted you about, that you wanted to make?
That was it.
That was it? Okay, great. All right, Jeremy, I want to get to this other question about racial politics. There's no way that we need another full hour, but I do want to air it out because I do think it's good for us all to think about going forward. So Jeremy says, I'm curious to hear what you make of the treatment of racial politics in the game. Most of the figures mourned by the game, the miner, the truck driver, seem to stand in for a mostly white working class. Interestingly, Mammoth Cave in Act 3 is an actual site that was historically mined for saltpeter by enslaved Black people in the early 19th century. Yet the game rarely addresses directly the legacy of chattel slavery. Where do you feel race figures in the game's treatment of class struggle and of the wreckage left by capitalist resource extraction? So yeah, I know that there's no way to address this adequately, but I would like to hear what you all think about that, and I would like to hear more about the way this game addresses race and the sense you think it makes of it.
I'll try to be so quick. You can set a timer for like a minute and say stop talking now, because like you said, I could talk about this for an hour. And Jeremy, thank you so much for asking this question, because I think it is something really important to me about this game. So earlier I was talking about the Gothic, and I said, we fundamentally should think about this as a genre of dark secrets or sort of dark history that we've tried to oppress, sort of rising out of place and coming back to haunt us. So when we take that across the Atlantic and we move into the Southern United States, of course, it's fundamentally going to be about the plantation systems and the horrors of slavery, right? Like these are sort of the horrors of regional place rising up. And so I do wish that Kentucky Route Zero made this a little bit more overt, because certainly Kentucky has so much of this trauma buried in place coming up. And so to me, it sort of seems like the game slides around it. Like you mentioned that Mammoth Cave was mined by saltpeter. Well, Mammoth Cave was actually also mapped by Stephen Bishop, right, who was an enslaved guide. So because people didn't want to risk it themselves, right, they would send enslaved men down to do most of sort of the dirty work or the labor. And you can see a lot of the markings in caves are often like Stephen Bishop wrote his name everywhere, every time he found a new pitch, a new passage. And you can still see that as you're going through, right? So in some ways it's like a positive piece of history kind of coming through, but also reminding you, like when you're on this nice tour, when you're walking through, it's that this was exploited labor, right? And it's dangerous to map caves. You're like going underwater, you're fighting through, it's scary, right? And then two, so much knowledge. I think this game is also about potential that was lost, or sort of, you know, this, what we could have had that was lost, right? Sort of progress and thriving places that were gone. And I think too, you know, when parks became national parks and when Mammoth Cave became national park, they were segregated spaces. And so even though it was like post-slavery and it was the supposed time of racial progress and civil rights, there had been Black families living there for generations and generations and generations that had so much knowledge of cave systems and the environment and the place that were just told, like, go. You know, if you can't be a guide, you can't tour, you can't live here. So what did we lose, right? That not only it's the sort of left behind space because of larger systemic forces, but also there's certainly a racial loss as well, and racial pain and racial politics that have caused this destruction.
Zoyander, anything
I don't
to
think
add?
I have a lot to add because it's definitely not my area. I think it's a very good critique of the game to say that like race is largely invisible, although like in terms of shallow representation, it's, you know, it's fine. Like the main characters are not all white, but that legacy isn't really addressed. And there's a flatness to it. I think a strength of the game is that it doesn't tidy slavery away as if it's over. It shows pretty clearly that slavery changed form and is continuing. But again, it doesn't figure that in terms of the racial politics of America. And it's probably a huge gap.
All right, well, thank you both, and thank you all for your excellent questions. We do have one more question from Adam, and Adam, I'm sorry, we're not gonna be able to get to talking about that, but Adam wanted to know about Here and There Along the Echo, which is a segment of the game that takes place in a phone tree. And it's just incredibly well written. But anyway, that goes to the general point, which is like, I think we'd all recommend that you pick up this game. You can find it on lots of platforms. It's pretty much anywhere you might want to play it in terms of computers and different video gaming consoles. So, thank you so much to everyone for being here with us. Thank you specifically to Zoyander and Rachel for joining me today and for your wise thoughts and patience with my questions and occasional interruptions. Zoyander, I'll put in chat, I wanted to say you can find more about Zoyander and their work at zoyander.cc, including some criticism and writing and games and other things. It sounds like there'll be more soon as well as you're working on some things. I'd also like to thank my colleagues at the Center for Science and the Imagination, as always, for making this event possible, and especially to Tyler Eglin for running the tech and editing the gameplay videos. We'll be hosting one more CSI Skill Tree event later this year, and we're going to be doing more of them in 2022 as well. So we're going to keep a slow roll and keep this series going because of conversations like this are just so amazing. To get notified about episodes, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on Twitter at ImaginationASU, and visit us at csi.asu.edu, where you can subscribe to our emails. So thank you once again to Zoyander and Rachel and everyone. And thank you all so much for joining us and being here with me today.
Thank you, Joey. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.